All right, so welcome back. This week we're going to be focusing on performance and culture. And we're going to be looking just at 4 readings this time instead of 6. So in this lecture we're going to do a brief overview about performance and the different cultural formations that are performed. So let's work with the baseline definition of performance as an embodied cultural action bounded by specific places and times. Right, so right now I'm performing. I'm waving my hand about. So when we're talking about performance, we're focusing on bodies, an embodied cultural action. And as a cultural action, it's something filled with meaning. For example, the difference between this and this is the cultural meaning that's given to that particular embodied performance. Also, when we talk about it as happening in specific places and times, a performance is not like a text. A text exists. It's reproduced, it's repackaged, it's disseminated, it's circulated, whereas performances often tend to be one-time things unless they're turned into texts. So over the course of these 4 readings, we're working with 4 different senses of performance. First of all, we can think about performing tradition and ethnicity through the article on selling Chineseness on the Lunar New Year parade. So here we're thinking about the relationship between ethnicization and racialization. And you'll recall that whenever we talk about something being ization, we're talking about the specific process through which it comes to take on that meaning. So on the one hand, we have the racialized meanings that it takes on, and on the other hand, we have the ethnic meanings that particular performances take on. The article gives you a rundown of the specific things that are done to create this sort of Orientalist atmosphere as both a racialization and an ethnicization. One key term I want us to pay attention to is on page 151, with the definition of counter-memory, a way of remembering and forgetting that starts with the local, the immediate, and the personal. So here we're talking about performance in terms of these micro-level actions, these little embodied performances, right? A parade is a special occasion that depends on the bodies of those who participate in it. And here's another way of thinking about the relationship between capital and politics. You recall affect, aesthetic, capital, politics? We can think about capital in terms of the ways in which model minority identity is performed through specific modes of representation. Also, if you turn to page 156 of this book chapter, we can think about the cultural politics of institutionalization, transforming this very local event into a mainstream event that becomes televised and becomes broadcast and is transformed into a particular kind of text that may or may not be in relationship with the performance that it's supposed to represent. So then here, in thinking about the relationship between capital and politics, on the one hand, there is corporate sponsorship, there are vendors making money, it's bringing tourist dollars to Chinatown, etc. But on the other side of politics, we're thinking about, on the one hand, the politics that go into representing this ethnic celebration, and on the other hand, the politics that go into transforming it into something that's palatable for multiple publics. So then here we're no longer talking about local community events as it gets transformed into a public event. You recall this chart of different scales from last time. So if we move on to the article on baseball and Sandy Nava, we begin thinking about how race and ethnicity are performed as public identities. So whereas on the one hand we're thinking about ethnicity as a thing, here we're thinking about it as an identity that becomes shouldered. So if you look at page 255 of this article, we can talk about how race and nationality become performed through a discourse to an audience, how symbolic meanings are taken on through what is said and how it ends up being said. So even though Sandy Nava is not doing anything that constitutes a particular racialized or nationalized performance, each of these broadcasters and journalists participates in creating this discourse through written performances of the racialized and nationalized meanings of baseball. So if you look at page 232, there's the discussion of how racial meanings are performed through nationalism. So since Latinos are marked as nationally other, they do not register in terms of sports history or the black-white binary that the author discusses. So the third article we can talk about in terms of performance is performing community, however you may construe that, through Evan Cooper's piece on John Leguizamo's culturally intimate humor. That's the term that first pops up on page 437 of that article. So if we're talking about things that are culturally intimate, we're then talking about in-group and out-group members of a community. If you're out-group, you may not be familiar with it, whereas if you're in-group, it may take on a certain kind of special meaning because it has a special dialogue with how you've come to understand the world, cultural intimacy. This also gets to this issue of private humor, which is something that we'll talk about on the discussion board. If we're talking about private humor, of course, humor doesn't take place by yourself. It's always an exchange between multiple people. But the privacy of it, airing your dirty laundry or telling jokes that certain people could laugh at and others can't, I don't know what your ethics are on the issue, that becomes very much an issue of this divide between public language and private language, which we'll talk more about in the next lecture. An important thing to pay attention to as we're talking about performing community are those other modes of identity and difference that come to intersect. For example, the first full paragraph on page 452 of the article, as we head towards the conclusion, has an interesting discussion about class and representation. How even though people may feel culturally and ethnically intimate with John Leguizamo's humor, there's a lot that gets overridden in terms of one's class basis and the ways in which class and socioeconomic status determine what respectable and good representations are. And finally, a fourth way we could talk about performing identity is in terms of performing pan-ethnicity. And here we're looking at the book chapter from Deborah Wong on Asian Americans Making Music. So if you look on page 115 of this chapter, we can see how Asian American, in terms of pan-ethnicity, can be talked about as an emergent identity in conversation with histories of activism. So if we think about activism, that most in particular is a kind of performance, a performance of the political, and the ways in which that gets embodied. If you think, for example, about protests, those very much depend on the spectacle created through the numbers of bodies, which are rich with cultural action that send a particular meaning to local or national government. So I want us to think about what Deborah Wong says on page 120, that smallness is the chief place where resistance can happen. This takes us over to the board where we think about performance, which is so on small levels depending on individual bodies coming together as a collection and transmitting individual meanings through behaviors and practices and actions. How this relates to performing identity, performing community, transforming institutions through performance, and creating its larger message to send out to multiple publics, right? If we're talking about multiple publics, we are then thinking about, for example, mainstream US culture, dominant culture, however you want to talk about it. When we talk about these performances or these popular culture texts that we've been talking about throughout the semester, we're not talking about so much individual community things, but things that become public representations that also speak to identity, right? So that's it for this lecture.